You know, even all these years later, I still can't get over the fact that the murderous tardigrade that we meet in the body horror segment of this episode is the same tardigrade from the adorable animated kids episode of Short Treks. Body horror is adorable. Hello interwebs and welcome to my rewatch and review of Star Trek Discovery Season 1 being done in preparation for Discovery's final Season 5 later this year. And today we're going to be reviewing Episode 3 of the first season, Context is for Kings, aka the first regular episode of Discovery after the pilot and the intro to the hero ship herself, or aka the episode where everyone on Discovery hates each other, if you listen to the internet. And just a reminder, if you want to check out my review of the two-part pilot as well as some of my thoughts on Discovery overall, you can check that out in this video over here. But with that said, let's spore jump into this episode. And I should say spoilers for not only this episode, but Season 1 of Discovery as a whole, but nothing really beyond that. So in many ways, Context is for Kings feels like a second pilot for Discovery because most of the actual status quo of the season, as well as the series, is established here. And what shocked me most while rewatching this is just how much the entire episode leans into this creepy, uneasy vibe as Burnham slowly uncovers the true purpose of Discovery, as both she and we are introduced to the various crew members and the ship itself. I already spoke about in my last review how this episode, or at least some version of this episode before it was potentially re-edited, was quite possibly supposed to be the actual pilot for Discovery before they went back at the end of the season to film what became Battle of the Binary Stars and the Vulcan Hello. And I think you can see some remnants of that in how this episode is structured, as we are introduced to Burnham as a prisoner, and there being hints throughout the episode of what she did in her mutiny without any direct references to it specifically.
See, we're unloading all kinds of garbage today. Even Starfleet's first mutineer.
While I do think that muddies Burnham's character a little bit, I do think that it makes this episode and this introduction to Discovery work very well because at least we have Burnham, a character that we already know from the pilot, acting as audience surrogate who guides us through uncovering the mystery of Discovery itself. It's really strange to return this episode right now because I know how integral the spore drive becomes to Discovery's identity as the series goes on. And so to see all the elements like the spore room, Stamets lab, and even the black alert all be played with this foreboding sense to them, it just has this like really strange feeling for me. But it is still incredibly effective even all these years later, even with me knowing what the ultimate revelations are. That being said, it's really funny considering that there's clearly some elements that were dropped later on, like the black badges that were obviously intended to allude to Section 31, that are played as some big mystery in this episode that is undercut by the more integrated way that Section 31 is handled as an accepted part of Starfleet in Season 2 of this show. But also things like Burnham seeing Detmer or Saru, characters from the pilot, and them being distanced around Burnham for her mutiny, but also being cagey around the intention of what the Discovery is a good way to build multiple layers of intrigue that doesn't just rely on the mystery box, but on actual character storytelling to guide us through, because Burnham has to navigate these fraught relationships that she feels responsible for while also playing detective. It just adds some nice layers of tension. On top of this, I think it is also better that we got those pilot episodes rather than starting with this one, because it would have been really strange to start a brand new Star Trek series after so long off the air with this very dark and foreboding feel. I mean, we literally begin in a prison shuttle, and we keep encountering characters that act in rather un-Star Trek-like ways. The prisoners, for one, are rather violent, and more importantly to me, they're also treated rather subhumanly, despite other Star Trek series establishing that the Federation has a restorative justice system that treats prisoners kindly. We also have characters like Landry, who literally call prisoners animals and dehumanize them, and she's just a straight up grade A asshole, even though she's played wonderfully by Battlestar Galactica alum Ray Kasharma. But that being said, that all fits this season's themes of Starfleet losing its values during wartime. So I think this dichotomy works much better, with us having seen Georgiou and the Shenzhou and a positive version of Starfleet in the pilot, and then going into this very oppressive feeling of the Discovery that gives us a contrast within the story itself, rather than expecting us to feel the contrast based on our pre-knowledge vibes of Star Trek as a franchise that is often more optimistic. That said, starting us with Burnham as a prisoner, relegated to accepting her lot for her actions, is an interesting start for a character, but it does bug me that one of our first images of our black woman lead in Star Trek is her being a prisoner who has to earn redemption. It fits the story that this season wants to tell, but still it reminds me a bit of how Sisko on Deep Space Nine, the franchise's first black lead overall, also had to earn being a captain when Picard or Kirk got to just be captains at the beginning of their series without any justifications. And then also Star Trek contributing to the imagery of black folks in prison feels a tad regressive. But again, that is in a larger conversation with the story this show wants to tell. That said, the fact that these convicts are traveling with only a single pilot who yeets it in the first 2 minutes of this episode is very weird, but also visually hilarious to me. Speaking of relationships though, this is the episode that I think most earned Discovery its overall reputation of being a dark show where everybody and every character hates each other. Indeed, I distinctly remember this scene where we had this conversation between Burnham and Saru where they felt particularly hurtful to each other, especially Saru.
I believe you feel regret. But in my mind, you are dangerous.
I always argue though that it's meant to be a season-long arc played out over multiple episodes, and as a result these more combative relationships make sense. Yet, rewatching, I forgot that there was actually a whole arc for Saru and Burnham within this episode itself, with Saru starting off not wishing Burnham was on the ship, then begrudgingly standing up for her, then acknowledging at the end of the episode that Burnham's worst actions didn't define her totally, setting Burnham up on that redemptive arc that even at this point she doesn't feel that she is worthy of.
That you were always a good officer. Until you weren't. If only you hadn't. You are a valuable asset. It is a loss for Starfleet.
It's almost as if the writers had a character arc in mind that all the disco haters who claimed it ruined Star Trek with SJW crap just either ignored or didn't have enough media literacy to understand. Or both. That all said, I can see why this episode would be off-putting to someone who would want a more prototypical Next Generation style Star Trek that we're getting today with something like Strange New Worlds. It's scenes like that showcase to me that there was a bit more care placed into what each episode was saying on its own than I remember it being, because my memory had me think of Discovery Season 1 having this problem that the later seasons, as well as the more contemporary Netflix Marvel shows like Jessica Jones or Daredevil had, where it didn't really feel like they were thinking about the show in terms of episodes, but more just one long movie that they just cut up arbitrarily into hour-long segments. Discovery, at least in this season, seems to have a much more clear, defined beginning, middle, and end to its episodes that sort of fit into the larger narrative than I perhaps remembered. All the characters introduced in this episode are great too. Mary Wiseman clearly portrays Tilly in a grounded, autistically coded way, providing what I think is a necessary bright light in an otherwise dark story. It's strange seeing Tilly in this episode because she feels a lot less quirky than I remember her being in later episodes of Discovery, so I kind of want to keep an eye on her to see if she gets Flanderized as we go on in the series, or if that's just my memory playing tricks on me as well. Stamets 2 is played incredibly grouchily by Anthony Rapp, again leaning into that criticism that everyone hates each other on the show, but even in this episode he gets moments of humanity, such as when we see him give a speech about physics as biology.
They are the building blocks of energy across the universe. Physics and biology? No, physics as biology.
All right.
I became an astromycologist because of awe. Awe at the miracle of life. I met Strahl, and we formed a partnership. We would get to the veins and muscles that hold our galaxies together. we would find truth. We were happy in our lab. Then your war started, and Starfleet co-opted our research.
Revealing his true passion for science that paints a picture of a much more three-dimensional character than my memory gave him in this season. And one that also puts him at odds with the growing warlike nature of Starfleet and Lorca, which also gives his initial grouchiness more context. But it is Lorca, played by Jason Isaacs, who is the real standout here. Despite only having a few scenes in this episode, he makes every second count, and his writing and performance is impeccable. I love the fortune cookies that give him some uniqueness, yet it's his affability that can quickly shift into subtle underscores of authoritarianism and superiority that hint at later revelations for his character that truly make him memorable.
I prefer to serve my time without getting involved.
You think I care what your preferences are? Till your vessel's repaired, you'll be assigned to quarters and put to work. I'm not a chauffeur. There's no free rides on my ship.
That said, I still don't know why the fuck he has a Tribble in his office. Also, just to mention here, the thing where his eyes have a sensitivity to light is a neat touch on its own in this episode, but now that I know what it's ultimately hinting at, his reveal of being from the mirror universe, I find it a bit trite now. I honestly wish they hadn't made that part of his mirror universe identity, because it comes off as kind of dumb in retrospect. Especially because we've never seen any other mirror universe character in Star Trek have that before. It kind of plays as ooh, it's this big hint for something you should have been able to guess all along, but there's no way we could have been able to guess it. So an interesting idea in isolation, but one in terms of how it's ultimately used that feels like it falls flat. Also, I do want to say, given that there is a later implication in the writing of the season that Lorca had a sexual relationship with the Mirror Universe version of Burnham, and in fact groomed her when she was underage, I'm incredibly thankful that Jason Isaacs doesn't play attraction in his performance with Martin Green at all. He only plays a mysterious familiarity with her.
I know who you are, Michael Burnham. I know exactly who you are. I know you love being right, but I suspect that you hate being wrong even more. So let me stop you going down a path you'll regret.
Imagine how rough it would have been to sit through multiple episodes of Jason Isaacs giving creeper vibes to Burnham. I do not want that at all. Also, there's a ton of great show, not tell characterization throughout this episode, like Saru offering blueberries to Burnham even though he doesn't fully trust her, or Tilly's awkward moment of kindness as she's the only one to reach out to Burnham and see her humanity, or Burnham quoting Alice in Wonderland in order to ground her during a stressful sequence, which itself was a way to highlight her conflicting Vulcan and human upbringings.
My foster mother on Vulcan used to read it to me and her son. She and I were the only humans in the house. It's how I learned that the real world doesn't always adhere to logic. Sometimes down is up. Sometimes up is down. Sometimes when you're lost, you're found.
Moving on, the sequence on the USS Glenn where we meet good old Ephraim the tardigrade is also suitably creepy. I'm actually really shocked how much work they put into even the brief glimpses of disfigured, transmorgified bodies that we get here. It's really eerie, and honestly, I wish we had gotten more of it. Still, what bothers me more is the fact that we never got a tardigrade plushie from the Star Trek merchandising team. Trek merchandising really needs to get into the adorable murderous creature plushie market. I'm just saying, I want a Moopsie. There are even some great non-intrusive Easter eggs like the Gorn skeleton in Lorca's office peppered throughout this episode. I honestly Chris pine for the days where big science fiction franchises didn't have to stop their entire plot cold so they could stop and point at an Easter egg and wax nostalgically about them. Yet, it's the final moment with Lorca that sells this episode for me. And I remember it being the moment that also sold me that the writers of Star Trek Discovery understood Star Trek even while they were trying to do something completely different with it. Lorca's speech that the Discovery is not trying to create a weapon of mass destruction, but a means of travel, a way to travel to areas of the galaxy that Star Trek as a franchise had never explored before, is a beautiful way to set up this concept of hopeful optimism potentially being turned to violence.
The Klingons. That's how you win the war. And we must win the war. But that's just the beginning. Imagine the possibilities. I see where they're going, where they've been. or where they could take us.
The show is starting to ask us these questions of, is there a way to look past the trauma and violence of the now in order to hope to create a better future from it? Or are these grand institutions like Starfleet going to be irrevocably changed by the necessities of the world and violence around them? Again, this series is clearly coming off the 2016 election in America, when many, capital L, liberal Americans began to become more critical of American institutions. And perhaps that is a way that we can reconcile the imagery of a black woman prisoner in this series with the show's themes, given America's long history with incarcerating black people, and how that ties into the long-standing systemic racism that America itself and many of its institutions were built upon. Something that became much harder for many Americans to ignore after Trump got elected, though many still certainly try. Also, given that this is a rewatch and we know that Lorca is from the Mirror Universe, we can see that his speech is clearly him being willing to wield idealistic rhetoric in order to obfuscate his more clear fascistic intentions as he manipulates Starfleet and Burnham, showcasing how someone like him can easily manipulate these institutions when they don't look at their potential for being used in this way. Overall, this episode does a fantastic job setting the tone of this season of Discovery and introducing us to its main elements and players while staying firmly centered on Michael Burnham's character arc. The mystery is excellently established with some intriguing threads for later, like Lorca's menagerie, and characters are given strong personalities and arcs. And there's also a willingness to use Star Trek's optimistic setting to tell a different kind of story that reflects on how we, the audience, view Star Trek within the context of the American political era in which it is produced, be it the original 1960s that reflected the more hopeful view of American institutions, or the more critical late 2010s of Discovery's creation. Context is for Kings is a great showcase of what Star Trek Discovery could be, but the question that I have is, does the series maintain this momentum as the season goes on, or does it lose its way as I remember it ultimately doing? That is my review for Star Trek Discovery Season 1, Episode 3, Context is for Kings. What did you think of this episode? I'd love to hear all your thoughts below. Tune back in next week for the next review that I have of Episode 4 of Season 1 of Discovery, and stay tuned to this channel and subscribe for my review of every episode of Star Trek Discovery Season 4 when it comes out later this year. Beyond all that, I hope you, my friends, live long and prosper.